Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha TV's coverage of the 75th session of the Indian History Congress taking place at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Today we are going to discuss Nehru and institution building in independent India. As independent India's first Prime Minister, Nehru laid the foundation of a democratic, liberal and inclusive Indian state. Thanks to his leadership, India today has stable democratic institutions, something that many post-colonial countries were unable to achieve. To discuss Nehru and his role in institution building, I have with me four distinguished historians of modern India. We have Professor Aditya Mukherjee, Professor at Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay, he is the Nurul Hasan Professor of History at Calcutta University. Professor Deepak Kumar, he is Professor of History of Science and Education at Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And Dr. Sahu, he is a historian who works as the Chief Archivist of RBI Archives, Pune. I welcome you gentlemen to this discussion. Professor Mukherjee, let me begin with you. When we say that Nehru was an institution builder, do we mean that he created stable and recurring patterns of social and political behavior in state structures which Indians continue to value, which are stable, and they have outlasted his tenure? Or do we mean something else?
No, we mean exactly that. But what were these institutions? It is on Nehru, because Gandhiji died almost immediately after independence and so did Patel. The entire responsibility of transforming this movement into government fell on Nehru. Creating the entire structures, as you said, of a modern democratic state with all the state apparatuses. Creating the parliamentary system, the cabinet system, the planning commission, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, the media, all of these is what the stuff of a modern state is. And Nehru had to create that. And he was very conscious that though he was the overbearing leader at independence, he could have done whatever he liked, that he must have people who respect these institutions, know how to work it. So much so that there are 5 volumes of his letters to the Chief Minister. If you read them, they are like catechisms. He's telling them that this is how you behave, this is how you do, this is how you do, this is how you must respect opposition, you must ask questions. So he's continuously, as you said, educating the Indian people on how to build and create these institutions, create a mindset where they respect this. I'll give you just one example of how deep was this notion that there is no democracy without an opposition. At the peak of his popularity, when he was to be chosen for the 3rd time as the President of the Congress, he feared that, there is probably a danger of he becoming having a great inflated sense of himself. There was no criticism, so he wrote an article in the name of Chanakya, with a pseudonym, critiquing himself and saying that Nehru should not be elected for the 3rd time. This may lead to Caesarism. There is no place for Caesarism in democracy. And similarly, you read the autobiography of, for example, C.D. Deshmukh, his finance minister. He says that Nehru in the cabinet would insist that we took our own decisions. Not like the situation we have now where people say that I'll take all the decisions, you just rubber stamp them, So I'm just giving you some examples of each institution, how he built.
We're going to discuss this in greater detail, but let me go to Professor Bandyopadhyay. To what extent did Nehru as an institution builder gain from the legacy of the nationalist movement? It wasn't as if these ideas suddenly, came to him. He woke up one morning and thought we should have parliament. But even if he thought of these things, what was it that he learned from the nationalist movement?
Actually, my assessment of Nehru would be partly coming from my lived experience as a very young child at that time, till he died when I was 14. And later on, my studies regarding him. And as far as I can remember those days, 1950s and early 1960s, I still remember that in the school, in the remotest part of this country where I was being brought up, what kind of resonance Nehru's name was bringing. And later on, when I tried to study some of the institutions that he built up, I found that the very uniqueness of it. It is not only they were unique because they are pioneer, but also they are unique because they are so well thought out.
No, but what was the legacy of the nationalist movement that he gained from, that he built upon?
The legacy of the nationalist movement, in the sense that, for example, you see that one legacy that on which Deepak also can point out, in 1947 in the month of May. He was actually working with a scientist, and he asked him that how long India would take to be a very developed country. So that person replied to him that it will take about 15 years if you take a short view of it, but it will take long years if you take a long view of it. And I think that Nehru had, the institution that he built up, he had all these things in mind, that development in the short term and development in the long term.
Professor Deepak Kumar, do you want to take that question, or shall I ask you another one?
Let me continue,
okay,
because the legacy is a very important thing. You know, his education, the way he was brought up, his experiences at Cambridge, his notion of science, which later on developed into what he called scientific temper, and the voracious reader that he was, an author, wrote several books, eminent historian, one can look upon him as. Apart from these, there were many other opportunities which he availed to educate himself and prepare himself as a leader,
But that's still Nehru as an individual.
Yes. For example, this Brussels Congress, League Against Imperialism, there he participates in 1928. He kept himself abreast with whatever was happening at that time around the world. The result was that Indian national movement didn't appear as some kind of a localized or South Asian movement. He made it part of the anti-colonial movement, which was going to have effect all around the world.
No, I must say, by legacy I meant something else. I meant, for
Yeah,
example,
can I answer this?
but I'm coming to you.
Okay.
The organization that he inherited, of the Congress party. For example, the peculiar multi-layered structure of the Congress, where you had district level units, where you had state level units, where the Congress had penetrated the peasant movement, the workers movement, the cooperative movement, caste and community organizations. So that organization which he inherited, did it allow people to participate in this process of institution building by making the government democratic and by making it accountable? That is my question.
It did. In fact, that is not the only way I would see the legacy of the national movement. I mean, that is also part of the national movement, what you described. But the big legacies, the big picture that emerges from the national movement are three basic ideas which are dinned into the minds of the Indian people, because our national movement was a prolonged movement, a mass movement. The three ideas were democracy, sovereignty, sovereignty and anti-imperialism, democracy, secularism, and a pro-poor orientation. From Dadabhai Naoroji onwards, this pro-poor orientation is there from the beginning and later with the socialists. This is the reason why Gandhiji chooses him as the successor, is that he quintessentially represented all four of these. And that's the legacy he brings to bear on the new modern state. All of these things. I mean, he excels himself, in fact, in the period 46 to 51, where he creates a secular state out of a situation where exactly the opposite was on the cards. You had a Holocaust-like situation. You had the riots, 5 million people killed, 50 million people homeless. In that situation, to make it into a referendum and say that we will build in 3 years' time and have an election and we'll build a secular India, is Nehru. Yep. He spoke to 1 out of 40 people in this country, directly on that election. So this is just one example, but that is the legacy he brought forward.
Dr. Sahu, it's one thing to say that Nehru embodied all the progressive ideological content of the nationalist movement. But did the existence of like-minded tall leaders also help him as an institution builder? For example, if he did not have like-minded Congress leaders along with him, alone, what could have Nehru achieved?
Yeah, you are right. There are many like-minded personalities who were definitely helping Nehru. And Nehru himself also wanted to take the inputs from various sources. As an independent view, I find that, as a student of history, that he was writing, after becoming Prime Minister, he was writing to several personalities to get feedbacks about what could be the better way to get the social and economic development for the country. So definitely he was taking inputs from various sources, including his Congress leaders as well as other heads of departments.
Okay.
Mr. Bharat Bhushan,
Yeah.
one historical point you should remember. Actually, while hearing Aditya's comment on this, I was thinking that you should not forget that when Nehru was ruling, the first 16 years after independence, many of the nationalists were alive also. So actually the legacy of nationalism that we are talking about, it was direct.
Yeah.
So it was not something that from the textbook we have to now find out that who is Patel, who was Nehru, and who was Gandhi, etc. They were leaving. Some of them were leaving.
Yeah.
So that is very important.
So basically, as Aditya said, he he embodied the ideology of the nationalist movement, but so did all these other people who were on the same page with him, and so did the organization which
There
he
are tensions.
inherited.
There are tensions actually. There actually Aditya is.
But he was a very keen listener. He respected. Look, you have stalwarts like Bidhan Chandra Ray, Prakasham, Kamraj, many more.
Or even his opponent, Hiren Mukherjee.
Hiren Mukherjee.
The best example of his listening to an opponent, his baby, the Nehru Mahalanobis plan. When he wrote this, when Manmohan Singh became the Planning Commission chairman, deputy chairman, he reported that he went through the files. Being an academic, he said, let me look at the files. And he found that there was on the margins a lot of notes by Nehru. Though his government didn't want people to see the margins, he looked at the margins, and in the margins he found this following story, which explains exactly what Deepak was saying. Nehru had asked his bureaucrats to send these plans to people all over the world to seek their opinion, as you were saying. So the bureaucrats, being bureaucrats, sent it to all the left, liberal, Nehru kind of people. So when Nehru saw the list, he was furious, and that's what he had written, that you wasted the paper on, that you sent. Send it to people who will disagree with me. And it was then sent to Milton Friedman, and Milton Friedman of the Chicago School then wrote a note on this. So this is Nehru.
Professor Bandyopadhyay, why did Nehru and leaders of his generation in India opt for creation of a multi-party democracy, universal suffrage, in a country that was marked by gross social, political and economic inequalities, where there was mass deprivation?
So do you think that mass deprivation and multi-party democracy is contradictory?
No, I'm not saying that I think like that. I'm saying why? Because they could have chosen another path.
Because
several years later, many colonies chose the path of single-party democracy, such as Zimbabwe. So I'm merely saying that why did they decide to choose?
Now the kind of training that he had from his education, and the kind of training that he had through his experience in this nationalist movement, I think actually led him to do this. And also that everything was not of his choice also. For example, that multi-party democracy was there. Actually the opposition to the Congress also were coming to an extent. So he had no, and the Constituent Assembly also experienced. There actually it has been provided, that multi-party.
Within the Congress, Congress was never a monolithic party in that sense. Within the Congress, there were different views, different kinds of views coming up, which you later see in many other debates, not only in Congress debates, later in Constituent Assembly debates. You will find several views coming up. And Nehru, as a Democrat, as a very keen Democrat, you see, listened to. And he always aimed at consensus. And Indian ethos also, I believe. Nothing else could have succeeded in India. If not democracy, nothing else could have succeeded in
But
India.
that's with retrospect. At that point, to imagine that this experiment would succeed, I think required a certain amount of boldness.
Oh, of course,
But
yes,
he had no option.
There was
He had no option, Bharat, because as he said, the movement that he was a part of was to begin with an open movement. It was a multi-class movement from the very beginning. From EMS Namudripad to Tej Bahadur Sapru were all congressmen. To Madan Mohan Malviya. So there was he is a product of a multi-party movement, multi-class, multi-party, multi-community movement for Indian nation. So the state that comes into being must also reflect that. That is number one. And the second thing is also true, that in a country, as you said, which is so disparate, you could not have a monolithic, if any attempt to have a monolithic party structure would inevitably lead to suppression of somebody or the other. So this was a wise decision.
Not only that, for example, when the first 5-year plan was being done, actually he sent Mohanlal to China. And actually the papers that Mohanlal had at that time created, it is kept in the Indian Statistical Institute, and we have found from there that Mohanlal actually argued that China has a very different type of collection of materials for planning.
Yeah.
And he said that actually you can use it in your own way.
Yeah.
So he has no closeness of his mind to learn from a communist country.
Dr. Sahu, quickly, do you think that Nehru actually forced a political revolution before a social revolution could take place in India by going for multi-party democracy, universal suffrage?
Yes, I agree with that, but I think Professor Mukherjee will elaborate on that point.
I would like to argue here that we should not differentiate between political revolution, social revolution. Social revolution was going on almost a century, mid-19th century. You have Mahatma Phule, you have Dayanand Saraswati, Vivekanand, many other whose inheritance Nehru felt and tried to incorporate. Ambedkar was there, and both worked in the same cabinet. Dr. Ambedkar was part of his cabinet.
Only till 1951.
That's right, he was part of the cabinet. In Constituent Assembly, they agreed on many points, even if wherever they differed, they were together. So Nehru was in that sense lucky. He had remarkable people to work with, absolutely remarkable people. And he grasped that situation. Those people were also lucky to have a leader like him. He was lucky to have compatriots like Aditya.
Okay, we need to take a break at this point. Stay with us, don't go away, we'll be back in a bit. Welcome back. We are at the Indian History Congress at JNU and discussing Nehru as the institution builder of modern India. Professor Mukherjee, before we went to the break, you wanted to add something about political revolution.
You raised a very
revolution.
important, interesting idea that did he put the political revolution before the social revolution? Now, I would like to say two things about it. Firstly, that the political revolution you saw in 1947 was at the end of a social revolution. Just because we didn't have a violent overthrow does not mean that we did not have a revolution. Absolutely. The Indian revolution just doesn't get counted. Even the Albanian and the Cuban and whatever gets counted, but nobody talks of an Indian revolution, partly because we are stuck in our minds with an insurrectionary, Leninist kind of Russian revolution kind of thing. We had a revolution. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second thing is, having got independence and created a political structure, Nehru was trying to make the next revolution. He was trying to create a social revolution, and he was trying to do it through instruments that he could handle. That is the bureaucracy, the whole, the BDOs and the whole, the village worker system, that community development program, and so on and so forth. He did not have, unfortunately, the capacity of Gandhiji to be able to mobilize the people. For the programs and the institutions that he created, a parliament, a good law, but who's going to implement all those? And he tended to rely on the left or on the bureaucracy to do that. And that was the catch that Nehru fell into, in a sense, the movement becoming government, which Gandhiji was very clear that one should not. And that's why he said, disband the Congress.
Well, but somebody had to govern the nation.
Somebody had to govern the nation, but he also wanted to make a revolution. So that's why I'm saying that he had this dual task. That's why I liked your question, that there was this dual task in his mind.
Let me take that question of social revolution, social conflicts further to Professor Bandyopadhyay. So what role did Nehru's leadership play in actually removing major sources of tension and conflict in Indian society through a process of deliberation, legislative deliberation? For example, removing landlordism and feudalism through law, constituting linguistic aspirations into linguistic states so that language doesn't remain a source of conflict, creating labor laws and creating rights of workers so that the conflict between workers and employers goes down, and so on and so forth, and bringing communal harmony. All this through a legislative process of deliberation and discussion, which is something very different. India hadn't seen it at that point of time, that such conflicts can be resolved by some people sitting in a building called the Parliament of India, and they can come to a conclusion.
No, that is very unique in one sense. For example, you see that the anti-Jamindari laws, the abolition of Jamindari, this all came in various states in the early 1950s, and this could not happen without Nehru's support, because it happened in different states at different times.
It could have happened even without the support of the public, the masses.
Support of the public, of course, but some party has to initiate this, and his party and he initiated this. This is one thing. Second thing is this, that while doing some of these things, for example, the linguistic states, I think he was doing something and he was learning also. For example, if you just think of the creation of the first linguistic state,
Andhra Pradesh,
in 1956, then you will think that the famous fast of
Potti Sri Ramalu. Potti Sri Ramalu died in 1952 after 52 days of fast. Andhra was created much later.
And he did not initially support this fast, but ultimately he accepted this. Accepted it, and again through legislation. So similar things happened, and he was out and out an anti-communal person. So on this actually there was no compromise.
But let me take this question of communalism and social tolerance to Professor Deepak Kumar. So what role did Nehru's practice of social tolerance, his respect for diversity, for democratic procedure, and his refusal to reduce Indianness to a dominant religious or linguistic ethos play in building India as a modern state?
Very fair. Pandit Nehru knew that India was a deeply religious society. Still, he didn't make any use of religion or advocate a use of religion for political purposes. No. He talked about secularism. He talked about diversity. He wanted everyone to be taken together, and therefore, this is very interesting. In many other countries where decolonization took place, religion was invoked. He never. Now, I don't think he was an atheist. He was agnostic, not linked with rituals, etc. But he understood the significance of morale as contained in several religious codes, not opposed to them. He was all about ethics. He was all about rational thinking, not ritual but rational. So he tried his best, but somehow on certain occasions he couldn't succeed. For example, Hindu Code Bill, he succeeded. Of course, there was a lot of furor. With his own president, he had difference of opinion.
Rajendra
Prasad, you know it. So, but he couldn't succeed to bring about the similar reform in the Muslim community, which he had to, succumb and say that let the community decide on its own. A day will come. But he did try for a modern form of social arrangement, which would be away from the religious ambiguities and, of course, orthodoxy. Had he succeeded in 1950s and had the Indian people supported him to that extent, today many of these communal issues would not have come up. Here was a man whom we should look forward now as a beacon of hope, in the sense that harmony. I'm not using deliberately the term secularism and communalism, which today have come to such heated connotations, but this harmony, basic thing, and harmony, use of reason, scientific temper, these were the important...
I'm going to come to scientific temper in a bit. Dr. Sahu, earlier on in the break you were telling me about the notion of Indianness that Nehru had was not religious, but it was cultural, civilizational. You were talking about architecture. What were you saying?
Actually, Nehru thought that we should utilize the services of Indian artists and sculptures in decorating government buildings and other major architectural marvels. And he gave a direction also from the Prime Minister's Secretariat. A note was circulated among all the ministerial departments, which also went to other small departments through the ministries. It requested all the departments concerned that it should utilize the services of indigenous artists and sculptors, so that our Indian culture and civilization is reflected through these buildings. which was a little different from what we are having in the colonial period.
Here I will make just a personal comment. In the early 1960s, in a Mofussil town school, the teacher who was teaching us was always saying that we are Indians first and Indians last. It is, you see that the Nehruvian thing was going on and propagated to the remotest part of the country at that time.
Professor Mukherjee, Nehru worked hard to create institutions not only at the center but also the state. And you mentioned earlier the 400 odd fortnightly letters he wrote to chief ministers, which were all about humane governance and how to govern democratically and not be harsh with people and so on and so forth, tolerance of dissent. Now, no Prime Minister since Nehru has attempted to communicate with regional leaders in that manner. Why?
It's not true that nobody has. Indira Gandhi did actually, though in a different relationship. I mean, she did relate to people, but not what became the regional leaders. I mean, she was...
Or was it because the institutions of governance had already been built and there was no need for another person to become an architect and do the same thing as Nehru?
To answer your question, I think Nehru was deeply conscious. He was a highly educated man and read a lot of history, despite science being his basic discipline. And he was deeply aware that what he was trying to do was, I'm quoting him, a path uncharted in history. That is to create a modern democratic state, a modern industrialized society with democracy. Including land reforms. These had never been done in history. There was nowhere in history was land reform done with democracy. Nowhere in history was industrialization ever done with democracy. They were either done with colonies or with, on the basis of surplus taken out from workers and peasants, right? So he was deeply aware. And to do that, he needed to educate the Indian people that, that we are indeed trying to do something very new. And also, again, the creation of the nation, the way that India imagined its nation was again unparalleled in history, because modern nations emerged in Europe on the idea of homogeneity. And here was the first time that the idea that the difference will be celebrated, diversity will be celebrated and will not be seen as an obstruction to the creation of a nation. I mean, that is what he has to now bring into practice after independence.
Deepak Kumar, do you think Nehru helped build modern political parties and modern politics in India by basing politics on individual interests and group interests rather than on sacrifice and a notion of transcendent nationalism?
No, I don't think he ignored the quality or notion of sacrifice. In fact, in his terms, political participation was, was a noble
but
act.
Essentially represented interest group politics. So you had peasants and you had workers and you had landlords in the party, you had religious interests also within the Congress.
But these interest groups, he tried to have some kind of coordination, some kind of consensus. He never allowed them to get into selfish groups. So I don't see that, the kind of politics which we find later in 1980s, 90s or later, you come across. One example I would give, if you look into, for example, the parliamentary debates of 1950s, how different they are from the debates of, say, last 10 years, 15 years.
Or lack of debates of last
whatever it is, lack of debate, of course, I agree. But even in 1990s, so 1950s, till I think 1967, which I consider to be a watershed in Indian contemporary India, you have a different kind of, Indian politics operated at a different level. We have gone down, unfortunately.
All right.
I agree that Nehruvian politics was not the politics of accommodating interest groups, and that is something that happens much later.
Party structure, political party structure was based on interest groups.
I would say that even then, even the party structure, Nehru tried to build it on the basis of ideology and nationalism and long-term interests, rather than accommodating. This is something that you're probably back projecting from the current situation. These are diseases that emerge a little later.
All right.
Perhaps.
Okay, we need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back with you in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing Nehru as the institution builder of modern India on the occasion of the 75th session of the Indian History Congress at JNU in New Delhi. Professor Deepak Kumar, we all know that Nehru initiated India's space and atomic research program, set up IITs along with state sector steel plants, built dams and machine tool factories. But why is it that people who have benefited from the setting up of that kind of industrial edifice criticize whatever Nehru did? Is it because these enterprises have lost their usefulness?
Oh no, not at all. He laid the foundation.
Yep.
Actually, we were lucky to have a leader who had scientific spirit and scientific temper foremost in his mind, in his writings, in his thinking. And you know, the best part of his institution building activity is reflected in these institutions. He called the big dams, which we are, you know, these days we do criticize, our environmental friend would criticize as disasters or not for sustainable growth, etc. But he called them temples of modern India. Bhakra Nangal, Hirakud, etc. And look at the institutions which from 1947 onward came up. He used to meet scientists directly. Sometime whenever he was bored with his official duty, he would go walk to NPL, move around with Professor K.S. Krishnan, National Physical Laboratory, yes. Walk with K.S. Krishnan to re-energize himself. Bhatnagar, S.S. Bhatnagar, who was then the Director General of CSR, he was Chairman of UGC, he was Secretary Education, very powerful, 3 in 1. And there was, people used to say that it was a Nehru-Bhatnagar effect, you know, establishing so many CSR labs. Today it is very easy to criticize many things with the benefit of hindsight. But at that time, if we locate ourselves in 1950s, when you look into the context, then you see how forward-looking and much ahead of time he was.
Yeah.
Had it not been the case, today we are all singing about Mars and, you know, Chandrayaan and all this. The foundations were laid then.
Yeah.
And he picked up the right people. That was his genius. Picking the right people. Patronizing them. I'm using the term patronizing within single quote. Patronizing, giving them full autonomy. There was, so that's how, you know, a new nation with very feeble foundations. Cultural foundations were strong. Financial foundations were very weak. Many other things, you know, devastated state of affair. But he tried to build up.
Professor, that Nehru also requested the people of India to contribute to the national plan loan. So that way he wanted that there should be some funds for developing India.
Yeah. But Planning Commission, let me come to you, Professor Bandyopadhyay. Why did Nehru set up the Planning Commission after independence? And why has that model of planning become not, you know, irrelevant today, as some people would claim?
No, before going to that questions, actually, I will just like to add what Deepak was saying regarding the hindsight. You know that it is the very great paradox that hindsight, which is available to the smallest men like us, may not be available to the greatest men of his time. So what, for example, this environmental consciousness, what came after the mid-1960s and early 1970s, this was not available to him.
Yeah.
But there the more important question is this, that to what extent the environmentalists are seeing today's program and Nehru's program, they should be compared. And then we can find out that what is the difference. That is one thing. And the question that you have just now asked, I think that he was to a great extent influenced by this socialistic pattern, Soviet experience at the time of planning, and he had, I think, huge notion of development. Otherwise, actually, he could not have initiated such a grand program of planning. And this planning program, I think that first we are discussing to another program very recently in the Rajya Sabha also TV, that it went on very successfully in the first 15 to 20 years. And then actually somehow this planning question is gradually coming to not to so much in focus because of the fact that certain global changes were taking place from the 1970s onwards.
We will discuss it, but let me ask you this, Aditya.
Say something more on the planning? You see, I don't think that planning is, just to take a slightly different position from yours, the planning became necessary because the state was trying to telescope almost a couple of centuries of development into a few years. We didn't have the luxury like other countries which modernized to do it in normal historical time, and that telescoping of this process required state intervention. So it is not only the Soviets, but it's Vishwasaraya in India who first in the 20s talks of planning. Our the 1930s, the Congress party talks about planning, and the Bombay plan is made by the capitalists. So it is the right and the left were all agreed that if you were going to change Indian reality rapidly, you had to have state intervention.
Okay, so just to take this question forward, because Nehru, besides planning commission, he also set up term lending institutions like IFCI, Industrial Finance Corporation of India, ICICI, Industrial Credit and Investment Corporation of India, IDBI, the Industrial Development Bank of India, which actually they were instruments for transferring savings from poor Indians to Indian entrepreneurs, and which is what happened. He also provided the entrepreneurs a closed market, a protected market, and generated a local demand for them. Yet today the same entrepreneurs pretend as if they are not standing on the edifice created by Nehru, and that whatever they've achieved today is on their own.
I would say it's a shame.
Difference in the entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs of the 1920s and 30s were brilliant economists as well as political scientists. Keynes used to correspond with Birla on matters of finance. Purushottam Das appointed the professors of Delhi School of Economics. V.K.R.V. Rao was Purushottam Das's research assistant, right? So we were talking of different class of entrepreneurs. And in the 1950s, the task precisely was to create conditions for these entrepreneurs to develop, right? But over time what happens is that because they were given that protection, they got used to it, and they built this nexus, where they started earning rent virtually through the license quota Raj, which is post-Nehruvian. And they wanted to extract from the state, in a sense, favors which were not deserved. But to make available finances for investment was precisely the role of the state. I think bank nationalization also did the same, which is not to say that bank nationalization was not good for the poor, but of course it mobilized resources for the... But the thing is, if you don't have the planning commission, to come to your second question, then you raise the resources.
Jan Dhan Yojana does the same thing today.
Yes.
Mobilizing savings from the poor.
Yeah. But if you don't have the planning commission, then what you do with these resources is unregulated. I think that's why you need a planning commission.
Professor Deepak, Nehru's enormous contribution in setting up scientific institutions, you've already discussed that, CSIR, DRDO, space, atomic energy, but he had a particular notion of science, and I would like to quote something from him and for you to react to it. He said he wanted science to work for society, and he wrote, and I quote, "For a hungry man, God has no meaning, and India is starving, and to talk of truth and God and many other finer things is mockery. We have to find food for people. Clothing, housing, education, health are absolute necessities that every person should possess. When we have done that, we can philosophize and think of God. So science must think in those terms and work along those lines on a wider scale of coordinated planning." Unquote. Now my question to you is the agenda of Indian science and scientists still the same? Yes. Do they work for society? Do they work for a certain kind of niche market? What are they driven by?
No, they are. But society must loom large.
But does it loom large?
It does. I think it does. You talk to ISRO, and the chief says that even the Mangalyaan mission, it is a technology demonstration. But finally, all these technologies are going to help there is a very interesting instance which comes to my mind. Gandhi once visited Indian Science, this great institution in Bangalore,
Indian Institute of Science?
That's right, Institute of Science. And the students took him around the lab, etc. Gandhi asked them how all this is going to benefit.
Yeah.
His talisman was poorest of the poor. The student said, sir, we work on cosmic ray physics and things like that. We don't. But he said, you are being paid by these poor people, they pay them. He said, no, Tatas fund us. He said, even Tatas take the money from the poorest, when the things are sold to the market. So, by asking these questions, Gandhi had introduced what you call notion of social accountability. There were no easy answers. The same question Nehru continues to ask. He gave state money to these state-funded institutions, but notion of accountability, you look into his addresses at Indian Science Congress. He is the only politician to become the president of the Indian Science Congress, after independence. So far he remains there. Every year, of course, Indian Prime Minister addresses them, but he took very active part. And this accountability he always asked for. So science is a social construction, he knew it. Science has to work for the society. He never wanted something like a ivory tower science. If it becomes in some places, it is our mistake. But science is a people's activity.
All right.
Well, but I'm not doing that. I mean, slightly difference of opinion with Deepak on this. This was the Nehruvian view. I totally agree. But I don't think that, apart from some very exceptional individuals and some institutions that he referred to, I don't think this has remained the dominant discourse of Indian science. I mean, an IIT professor once told me that he's delighted. And when I asked him what is he delighted about, it was not that some student had made a discovery or an invention. He said, my whole class has gone to the US. Now, you see, this is not Jawaharlal Nehru. And if you look at science policy, this is his field, but if you look at what the government and have been planning to do, etc., is not to create independent institutions of science, which is what Nehru was. We are now sending our scientists to the US, 95% of whom stay back there, where the US science establishment plays the orchestra and our guys are just the members of the ensemble. We have not created a scientific establishment where we play the orchestra.
Yeah, right.
And that's where the failure is. That's where the Nehruvian perspective has gone.
At one point, that if you see the history of CSIR, for example, you will find that till the Nehruvian period, in the way CSIR was working, actually the new technology was...
No, he made that point. The way CSIR labs worked then and now.
What is the
big difference? But my question to you was, Nehru was also for scientific temper. Science went with scientific temper for Nehru. Now, how is it that the people who are sending Mangalyaan, the Mars orbiter, actually go to a temple to pray before the most modern spacecraft takes over, or they go and break coconuts in front of it? We had a CSIR Director General, also Director of Indian Institute of Science, S. Bhagwantam, who was a great devotee of Sai Baba, who used to produce Seiko watches from thin air. So, science has progressed in India, no doubt. But what has happened to scientific temper?
Actually, this is a very, very difficult question in the sense that a human being actually lives in a very, very different realms, and this is not only for the scientists. This dilemma is there in very many ordinary people also. So when a person is actually working in the laboratory in the way he is working, and when he is going to a temple in the way he is praying, this may not always work together, may not actually...
Or is it the fear of the residual, that we've done all the scientific calculations, the probability of failure is this much, but God only knows, maybe we've left something, so let's break a coconut.
No, I think we must distinguish.
There are certain things which have cultural origins. So, I don't think I can make a great deal of fuss about it. Most of the scientists in West, they go to attend a Sunday Mass, but that doesn't affect their science.
This is what I'm saying.
Do they go there to pray for better results?
No.
No, one must distinguish between being religious and being obscurantist and unscientific.
Yes,
it is possible for a scientist to be spiritual and to be religious, but it is impossible and unacceptable for a scientist to say that Ganesha's head was put by plastic surgery. That is not religion. That is the absence of scientific temper.
At that note, we've run out of time in this segment. We need to take a break. We'll be back with you in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing Nehru, the institution builder of modern India. Professor Bandyopadhyay, were there institutional structures such as the bureaucracy, the army, the police, the judiciary, the Indian Penal Code, the Criminal Procedure Code, forest laws, land acquisition laws, which Nehru unquestioningly inherited and adopted for modern India? You only needed to change people, at the helm of affairs. These structures remained the same. So why were these institutions completely left out?
I will actually take up only one issue from your question, and this is regarding, for example, forest laws. Forest laws.
Yeah.
So if you compare, for example, the 1894 Forest Act of India and 1952, the National Forest Act of India, you will find no change. No change. The major changes came after his death around 1970s and most importantly in the 1990s.
My question was, why were some institutions left untouched? It was as if you were trying to copy the colonial state but putting different people at the helm to implement the laws and so become judges or become generals and become police chiefs.
No, because this thing, for example, actually some question we are actually having this question through our lived experience. So the forest laws, to what extent they are wrong, that came to people through legislation and through movement much later. So actually when he was developing the national forest laws in 1952, actually he was following to a great extent 1894 Forest Act. So here actually colonial thing did not change overnight.
Yeah. Aditya?
You see, I don't agree that all that happened was that the brown Saab, the white Saab was replaced by the brown Saab.
Some areas. In the army it happened. In the police it happened. The judiciary it happened.
Okay, in some areas, but even in these areas, I mean, right at the beginning, there was a lot of debate. I mean, Nehru was torn by the question that can we have the ICS, for example, continue? And the effort was to transform the quality of the people inside. In some cases, they succeeded better. Like I think definitely in the bureaucracy, there was the Nehruvian bureaucracy that did get created with the national developmental approach. In other areas like the police and the judiciary, it took much longer. And in areas like the environment, it was not really colonial. What was thought to be scientific in the 19th century is what was considered scientific till the 1950s globally. And then globally we made a shift, and we also made the shift in the 70s like everybody else did.
Dr. Sahu, what do you say to people who run down Nehru's contribution to institution building by saying that if only Patel had been, Sardar Patel, his colleague and comrade, who was always a member of the Congress party and on the same page as Nehru on most issues, if Patel had become the Prime Minister, things would have been very different. But Patel died in 1950, 2.5 years after independence. So is this a false comparison? Nehru versus Patel?
Yeah. Nehru was, to my mind, Nehru was a leader par excellence, and he was rightfully chosen by Gandhi as his political successor. So at that point of time, Nehru's vision, Nehru's background and Nehru's contacts definitely proved him to be a statesman, and by choosing, to my mind, by choosing him as the successor at that point of time was definitely a right choice that Gandhi had made.
But Patel, people who talk about Patel are making a false comparison, you think? Because Patel wasn't there to build these institutions. He would have laid the foundations of some of our institutions, but he wasn't there for long enough.
Yeah, no doubt. Sardar Patel was a very strong contender, and also he had a vision. He has that the personality to take over, any kind of situation that would have been given to him. And he has also proved whatever portfolio he was having, he has proved his ability.
A false dichotomy is made between Nehru and Patel. It's a politically created dichotomy. Nehru and Patel, if you read their correspondences with each other, were shoulder to shoulder almost on all the agenda of the Indian national movement. Patel did some things better, like the organization of the party, etc. Nehru did some other things better, like communicating with people. But they were on all issues, including on the Hindu-Muslim question. That is why Patel's name is brought up, as if he was a Hindu communalist. It's completely false.
Well, he banned the RSS.
That's right. Put 25,000 of them in jail. Also, in terms of radicalism, Patel is called Sardar by the peasants. He was a peasant leader. He was the first leader of the Kisan Sabha. You know, so we have this completely false notion of Patel of being some, you know, something else.
We'll leave the controversy there. Professor Kumar, some critics of Nehru praise him for institution building, but condemn him for his socialism. Now, do you think that socialism and institution building, the institution Nehru built, they were inextricably linked, or can they be assessed separately?
No, they were inextricably linked. You know, early 20th century, even in the West, social democratic notions were being discussed. Everywhere people were talking in terms of mass welfare. Economists talking in terms of welfare economics. Despite the devastations of the First and Second World War, despite the Great Depression, despite the Bengal famine, all these things, there was no other way one could have looked at. Even Gandhi is a socialist minus violence. He's a socialist. Look at M.N. Saha, the great scientist, socialist. His Science and Culture, the journal, the debates which he... So everybody at that time, Subhash Bose, to a large extent socialist. And they agreed on many things. He chaired the first National Planning Committee meeting, Subhash Bose. So you will see that those days, you know, socialism was definitely, I wouldn't say magic word, but the right word to describe the aspirations of the people. Today it has become maligned or whatever, that's different reason. But I don't subscribe to it.
Professor Bandyopadhyay, why is it that 5 decades after his death, Nehru's reputation is thought to be diminished? So there are people who believe in free market who say that he was the architect of the license permit Raj, although Aditya says it happened after him. The communists accuse him of not implementing effective land reforms. The right-wing Hindus say that he appeased Muslims, he appeased Pakistan, he appeased China and Soviet Union all at the same time. So why has it become convenient today and fashionable to take pot shots at Nehru?
My answer would be to this question, a particular experience which I had on 14th of November 2014. I was watching one TV and there was some people who were commenting, and some of them who were actually opposing that there is no legacy of Nehru. They were so ahistorical. Actually, it is almost a sort of a political statement. Nothing to do with the actual assessment of Nehru in our present times. So I think after 50 years, the fact that you are saying that Nehru's legacy is now declining, it's also doubtful. Even Nehru, an extraordinary person, if he was also a product of his times, if he was living in 2014, he might have certain other views, not the major views he could not change.
Aditya, is this happening because in the Nehruvian vision the state was at the center of development, production, redistribution of wealth, and today development and production have gone into the private sector, and people say leave it to the private sector, and there is no question of redistribution of wealth. The state is withdrawing from its redistributive role. So is this the reason why? Because all this is happening, because as India gets integrated into a global economy, this is what is likely to happen?
I don't think so. I think in the time that Nehru was there, the state needed to participate into not only the education health but into the economy itself, and that was the consensus. It was the capitalists, the Bombay plan, which said that there must be a huge public sector. So that was the consensus. Time moved on, the nature of world capitalism changed, and there was a need for a shift. Nehru would have been among the first to have made the shift. So I don't think that positing of what is happening today as completely the opposite of Nehru. Only thing is, Nehru would not have given up the redistributive aspect. Now what we've taken some good things from the what is happening globally, but we've completely abandoned the Nehruvian.
Now, one last question and a short one-line answer from each one of you, please. For Nehru, secularism was the idea of India. Without secularism, there was no idea of India. And this at a time, as Aditya pointed out, when there was every reason for this majority Hindu country to actually go the Pakistan way, give up secularism. At that point, we remained secular. Today, when the lives of our people have improved materially, we have lived far better, we eat far better, we are better educated than we were in 1947. Today, why is there a regression from the secular ideal?
Simple reason, because scientific temper has gone down.
Okay.
Yeah, I also believe that time has changed.
Is that all?
Yeah.
Okay.
My answer would be just complete misreading of history. Misreading of history
is leading us to go to regressive ideologies. Aditya?
The forces which were the result of the national movement, which is what created the state, those forces are nowhere to be seen. The forces which stood opposed to the national movement today dominate Indian society, and that is why what you said is true.
We've run out of time. I would like to thank you, Professor Aditya Mukherjee, Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay, Professor Deepak Kumar, Dr. Sahu, for coming here and participating in this discussion. Thank you very much. That's all we have for you today. For continuous coverage of the Indian History Congress, keep watching Rajya Sabha TV. Goodbye and thanks for investing your time with us.